Between the hills, the stars, the sky, the river so clear, river so clear.
As we deepen into our service, let us set the tone for this service with words, "Here in this sanctuary of ancient dreams and wisdom and beauty, we come to grow," by Jack Mendelson. Here in this sanctuary of ancient dreams and wisdom and beauty, we come to grow, to be healed, to stretch mind and heart, to be challenged, renewed, to be helped in our own continuing struggles for meaning and for love, to help build a world with more justice and mercy in it, and to be counted among the hopers and doers. In the face of cynicism, darkness, brutality around us and within, we seek to align ourselves with a living community that would affirm rather than despair, that would think and act rather than simply adjust and succumb. Here, we invite the spirit of our own humanity and the healing powers under, around, through, and beyond it to give us the nerve and grace, the toughness and sensitivity to search out the truth that fears, the truth that frees, and the life that maketh all things new. And now we will join Unitarian Universalists all over the world in lighting our chalice. Would Will please come forward to light the chalice, which is a symbol of the spark of life in each of us. If you're on Zoom and you have a chalice where you are, I invite you to turn on your video to share while we light this. While Will lights the chalice, I'll read our chalice lighting words, the promise and the practice from Rebecca Savage. We light our flaming chalice as a beloved people, united in love and thirsting for restorative justice. May it melt away the tethers that uphold whiteness in our midst. May it spark in us a spirit of humility. May it ignite in us radical love that transforms our energy into purposeful action. This is a chalice of audacious hope. This chalice shines a light on our shared past, signaling our intention to listen deeply, reflect wisely, and move boldly toward our highest ideals. Dr. Jack Russell Weinstein, coming to us from Grand Forks. Dr. Weinstein is the Chester Fritz Distinguished Professor of Philosophy and Director of the Institute for Philosophy in Public Life at the University of North Dakota in Grand Forks. He's the host of Prairie Public's long-running show, Why? Philosophical Discussions About Everyday Life, which is now in its 17th season. That is a commitment, and that shows you that philosophy knows no bounds. There's always something to talk about, and I know that Jack will bring that to us today. He's also the author of 4 books, including the forthcoming On the Futility of the Moral High Ground, Israel, Palestine, and the Trolley Problem. So today, please help me in welcoming Dr. Jack Russell Weinstein to talk about what do we talk about when we talk about justice.
It's, I think, always useful to start with just what a definition of philosophy is, because so many of us use the term and can sort of vaguely define it, but aren't really sure what it means. And we end up thinking that it's just thinking deeply about stuff. And the problem with that definition is that it makes philosophy the exclusive domain of philosophers. And I don't want it to be that. We all think deeply. We all struggle with great issues. We all are interior and exterior and wonder how we fit in the world. And that's just not the purview of philosophers alone. So philosophy, every introduction to philosophy class always begins the same way. They talk about philosophy being the mixing of 2 words, philo meaning love and Sophia meaning wisdom. So philosophy is the love of wisdom, at least how the Greeks defined it. But that also is sort of pretentious, for lack of a better term, and also doesn't really help us get a sense of what it is. So what philosophy really is for me, and the way that I always define it, is it's questioning, investigating the fundamental assumptions of any discipline. And so it asks the questions that we ourselves don't necessarily ask about everything we do, whether it's, what makes fashion attractive or beautiful, what makes music appealing, why do we like harmony instead of dissonance, what is the nature of life, why are Why are there 12 notes in a musical instrument? Those sorts of things. So anything we do, we can have a philosophy of. We can have a philosophy of baseball. We can have a philosophy of friendship. We can have a philosophy of religion. We can have a philosophy of driving. We can have a philosophy of anything. And what I want to talk a little bit about today is the philosophy of justice, which is a word that we all use all of the time and which has very, very, very deep emotional connections to what we want out of the world. And of course, the Universalist tradition is deeply steeped in justice. And so what I wanted to ask is, what do we talk about when we talk about justice? What do we mean? And I think the best way to do that is to give just a little historical overview. And I always like to start where the Western tradition likes to start its own story. This isn't chronologically in terms of when things were actually written, but it is chronologically in terms of the way that the Western tradition likes to frame itself and frame its own evolution. And that, of course, starts with the Hebrew scriptures and the creation myth of Adam and Eve. The very first act of violence, the very first act of violence is between the brothers Cain and Abel. And when Cain slays Abel, he asks the first question that humanity asks, which is, am I my brother's keeper? To ask about our responsibility to our siblings, to ask about whether we are ourselves accountable for what we do to other people is the great task of justice, the great task of ethics. Justice is the word we use as an analog to the ethical word good. When we talk about moral people, when we talk about rightness, when we talk about being excellent human beings, we are usually talking in an ethical context, how we treat others and how we treat ourselves. But we also have to talk about this in terms of a political context, in terms of political institutions, in terms of the government, in terms of how we govern ourselves, in terms of how we treat our neighbors, not as friends and not as compatriots, but rather as people who we just live together with, who we live next to, who we have shared interests with. And that's what political philosophy is interested in. And so justice is the word we use instead of using the word good. It has a much larger connotation. And so when I ask, am I my brother's keeper? I'm not just asking, should I not kill the person who lives next to me? But I also am asking, am I responsible for feeding them? Am I responsible for caring for them? Am I responsible for loving them? Am I responsible for making sure that their bowl is as full as my bowl, that they have as much water as I have? My mother-in-law is currently living with us because she and my wife's whole family are from the mountains in North Carolina, and particularly Asheville, North Carolina, which, as many of you know, has been devastated by flooding. She was without power, without water, without cell service for a couple weeks. There were about 3-4 days when we couldn't reach her at all. And eventually, after about a week and a half of them struggling with no ability to flush the toilet, let alone drink water, Kim, my wife, flew down, spent a week taking care of her, and then brought her back. We found a place for her elderly sister. Kim's mother is 88 years old, and her sister is 97, and they were in this house without any power, without any ability to take care of themselves with the basic necessities. And what we saw when we looked at her and her neighbors is that everyone was taking care of themselves. Taking care of each other. That there was no violence, there was no looting, but instead the people who did have power would make coffee for the people who didn't. The people who had access to some sort of water or some sort of transportation would check on other people. When we couldn't reach her mother, Kim contacted an old high school friend from Facebook who then drove cross town to make sure that she was okay. And so when I talk about, am I my brother's keeper, what I'm really talking about is this whole project of taking responsibility for other people in our own lives. And this involves political acts as well as interpersonal acts. The next place that I think I like to go when I have this conversation also is biblical, and it's the code of Hammurabi, an eye for an eye. Now, I find this super interesting because an eye for an eye is an example of a precept that we regard as fundamentally brutal, as anti-pacifist, as somehow what we don't want ourselves to be. But if you look at it in context, excuse me one second. If we look at it in context, we see that actually it does exactly the opposite. The Hebrew scriptures are a very violent book. And when someone is assaulted, the revenge that is taken upon them is against the entire family. It's not just against the person who committed the crime, but it's about everyone who's related to them. When someone is raped or assaulted, in response, entire villages are decimated. And this can't stand because it escalates things beyond any comprehension. Things get out of hand so quickly that it leads to tribal violence that lasts, as we know, millennia, to say the least. What an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth says is we are not allowed to commit more violence than has been committed to us. The punishment cannot be worse than the crime. And this, as a limiting principle, is very, very powerful. Maybe it's not our ultimate goal. Maybe we don't necessarily want to stop at an eye for an eye. But in a world of excessive violence, in a world of excessive escalation, in a world where we are constantly pushing against the forces that want to make things worse and worse and worse, an eye for an eye adds a limiting moment that is really powerful and worth attending to. We move on from the Code of Hammurabi to Plato's conception of justice in the Republic, which of course is very famous. Excuse me. Plato's dialogues are basically plays between people who are talking with one another. And in Plato's Republic, they're trying to define what the definition of justice is. But for Plato, justice was a character trait. Justice was an idea that people had a harmonized soul, that there are three aspects of the soul: the will, the intellect, and the emotions, the passions. And that if they are properly ordered, then the person is a good and a just person. The will, of course, is our ability to be steadfast and to stick with our tasks. Our intellect is the ability to rationally think through things, and our emotions, our passions, are the things that motivate us to pursue our self-interest, but also the things that we desire. And Plato says when one of these things are out of order, we are distorted. And he looks and he sees that there are three kinds of people. He says there are people who have more will than anything else. There are people who have more emotions than anything else. And there are people who are more rational than anything else. And I don't know that we would want to sign our name to this account of humanity, but it is very compelling. And he says that in order to understand how these three people interact, we should take a step out. And instead of asking about justice of the person, let's ask justice of the city. And he says a just city is a city where everyone does the things where they're the best at. A just city is a place where the people who have the power of will, they're the guardians, they're the police officers, they're the people who make sure that people stay in line. The people who are passionate, the people who follow their emotions, they're the shopkeepers and the everyday folk who bake bread and build buildings and things like that. And then there's the people who are intellectually focused, and they should be our leaders. He calls them philosopher kings, which is a little embarrassing, but nevertheless is a very important idea, because what he's telling us is that our leaders should not be chosen based on whether they want to be our leader. For Plato, nothing disqualifies someone more for power than wanting to have power. Instead, leaders should be judged based on whether or not they're able to make their own decisions, whether they're able to decide things for other people, whether they're able to use their rational rather than their emotional or more military aspects of human beings to make rational decisions for other people. And what Plato introduces in the Republic is the idea that we can harmonize human interests, that we can all live in a society in which we pursue what we want in accordance with other people. And this notion of harmony dominates the theory of justice. This notion of harmony forever changes what justice is, because it says that we can live together despite the fact that we are different people with different needs. We jump ahead to the 17th century, and we introduce a guy named Thomas Hobbes. Now, interestingly enough, the 17th century is the beginning of modernity for philosophy. Everything post 1700s and 1600s is modern, which seems also a bit weird. And what makes Hobbes the first modern political philosopher is he introduces this idea of a social contract. He says, if we live outside of society, if we live outside of agreement, we are violent, we are hostile, we can't trust anyone else. We steal other people's stuff, people steal our stuff. We hit people over the head and hurt them. They do the same for us. And life is, and this is a very famous quote, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And Hobbes decides that the best way to solve this problem is that everyone gets together and has an agreement, a social contract, and says, we agree not to steal your stuff if you agree not to steal our stuff. We agree not to hit you over the head if you agree not to hit us over the head. And with that, we can create agriculture, we can build libraries, we can engage in scientific pursuits, we can have long-term planning for the first time. But the problem is, we have to make sure people abide by the rules because people are self-interested and people will lie and manipulate in order to steal other people's stuff and take other people's and hit people over the head. And as such, we have to have a leader. And so the social contract decides on one person or a monarchy or a group of people to oversee the justice of the society. And this is where it gets kind of funky, because for Hobbes, justice is whatever the leaders say. Justice is whatever rules the leaders say. And this runs counter to our intuitions, but there is a deep insight here. And that deep insight is, it is better to be afraid of one person than to be afraid of everybody. It's better to listen to one person than listen to the chaos of everybody. This is the difficulty that we face, because Hobbes also is modern in the sense that he is the first person to ever write down that we are all created equal. And what he means by we are all created equal is equally funky, because what he says is any person can kill any other person if they try hard enough. That some people are smarter, some people are faster, some people are wiser, some people are more patient, some people are more aggressive, some people are more violent. It all evens out because there's not such a difference between people that we can't ultimately be victims of everyone else. And so Hobbes's picture of humanity is a scary one, it's a hostile one, but it does introduce the idea, very famously, that we are governed because we consent to be governed, that the idea of a legitimate governance is more important than governance itself. And what I mean by that is there's that notion of goodness again, that notion of justice again, that legitimacy is the most important notion behind a government, that a government can only govern if we have agreed in advance that they are the ones who should govern. And so the social contract, by being an agreement between other people, or between lots of people, means that we give up our freedoms and we give up the ability to hurt other people in exchange for that safety and that security, and that we have done that of our own volition, that we have willed to do this. And because we have willed to do this, we are free because we are getting what we want. Jump ahead to the 18th century, jump ahead to the Age of Revolution, jump ahead to the American and the French Revolution, and we start to divide our theories of justice based around definitions of freedom and equality. And for the first time, post-Greek, post-Hebrew scriptures, post-Hobbes, the negotiation between freedom and equality becomes essential. And so we have two revolutions. We have the American Revolution, which is based primarily on the idea of being free. And we have the French Revolution, which is very based on the idea of being equal. And the last 250 years has been a negotiation between these two revolutions. Just as an example, the phrase left and right, where we talk about liberals being on the left and conservatives being on the right, this comes from the French Revolution. During the French Revolution, the French Assembly used to sit in a big room with an aisle in the middle, and the people who were pro-revolution, who were anti-aristocrats, who were what we would call progressive and liberals, they sat on the left. And the people who were pro-aristocracy and who wanted things to stay the same and who were anti-revolution, they stayed on the right. And so since then, just out of convenience, we call the left the progressives and the right the conservatives, just as this accident of history. How does this freedom and equality manifest itself? Well, I'll give you a thought experiment. Imagine going into the voting booth, which we are all going to do, I hope, in the next couple of weeks, and we have to decide which candidate we're going to vote for. In the American tradition, following a philosopher named John Locke, who is both the late 17th century and early 18th century, following John Locke, Americans are always taught that what we should do is we should go and vote in our self-interest, that we should go into the voting booth and we should say, hey, what do I want? What are my values? And which politician am I going to choose that represents my interests and my desires? And then I'm going to pick that one. Contrast that, however, with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, an 18th century philosopher who was the inspiration for the French Revolution. And he says, when you go into the voting booth, you shouldn't ask what I want. You should ask what's best for the community. You should ask what is best for everybody. So put aside your self-interest and ask, what is good for everybody? Because what is good for everybody is good for myself. And so we have these two contrasting traditions, what we call the liberal tradition and the Republican tradition. The liberal tradition is pro-individual. Everyone has very different values. Everyone has very different attitudes. And what we have to do is we have to live together and compromise and tolerate one another. And then we have the Republican tradition, and this shouldn't be confused with Democrat versus Republican. It's just spelled the same way. The Republican tradition says that what we have to find is shared values, and that we have to build a society based on a conception of citizenship that puts the collective first. And we are constantly negotiating these ideas. We are constantly negotiating the freedom of the American Revolution and the equality of the French Revolution and figuring out how it fits in our American society. We are not just bound by the American Revolution. We're bound by the history of political philosophy and discussion that has followed us for, again, millennia, and especially the last 200 plus years. Jump ahead to the 1960s and 70s, and we get a definition of justice that comes from a philosopher named John Rawls. And what he argues is that justice should apply to procedures, that justice should apply to the institutions. So justice is no longer how I treat you or how neighbors treat one another, but rather how government treats people. Is there a proper way of having a bureaucracy that treats everyone the same way, that has a just outcome? Because what Rawls believes is that if we have a fair system, and we start from conditions of fairness, then we're going to end up with fair results. And he postulates this scenario in which we have to figure out what justice is, and it's very, very deep and very, very powerful, and I'll use it as the last example for my talk. He calls it the original position, because what he's trying to do is he's trying to retain that social contract tradition, right? He's trying to go back to Hobbes, and he wants to say, look, we agree that legitimate governance is the most important thing, and we agree that justice is essential, and how the government treats people is the most important aspect of justice. So how can we create a society where everyone agrees to be governed? How can we create a society where everyone assents to the rules, the principles of justice? And so he says, imagine being in a room and being under what he calls the veil of ignorance. A veil of ignorance is a circumstance in which we can't remember who we are. We can't remember whether we're white or black. We can't remember whether we are gay or straight. We can't remember whether we're male, female, or non-binary. We can't remember whether we're rich or poor. We can't remember whether we're Christian or Buddhist or atheist. We can't remember anything about our values at all. All we know is that when we wake up, when we are freed from this veil of ignorance, we have to live in the society we've chosen. He says all people under those circumstances would choose the same two principles of justice. The first one, where everyone is equally free, and the second one, where any equalities benefits everyone, not just one person. That in fact, inequalities benefit the least well off. So think about No Child Left Behind or something like that, where our goal is to focus on those people who are struggling and help them. And so we end our discussion of justice with this idea that we have committed to I guess, three different ideas. The first is that we can live in harmony. The second is that we can balance freedom and equality. And the third is that we are our brother's keeper, that we are committed to the idea that we are responsible for helping others and using the government to assist others. And that leads to the answer to one of the great questions of our time, which is whether government is good. And Rawls believes that good government is excellent. That if we have a good functioning government, that taxation isn't theft, that rules and laws aren't limitations on our freedom, but rather what a good government does is allow us to live in harmony and to pursue our own interests in a way that also helps the least well-off pursue their own interests. And that's where we are right now in our discussion of justice. We are trying to figure out what it means to have good government and what it means to help other people. And certainly there are those who think that the government shouldn't exist and the government shouldn't help other people. But I believe, and my experience tells me, that those people are in the vast minority. They may be the loudest, but they are the least among us. The most among us believe that we are our brother's keeper, we are our sibling's keeper, and that we have deep fundamental commitments, not only to being good people, but to being just people, just in the way that the early texts wanted us to be. So thank you very much, and I hope that was a short but interesting talk for all of you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Weinstein, for your talk. And I do have a question that I hope you can enlighten further. As I was listening to the history of Cain and Abel fighting, and then you talked about Hobbes in the 17th century, and that he was saying, let's quit knocking ourselves over the head. Let's try to work together. All the things that we would accomplish if we quit arguing, fighting each other. And then going on to Rawls and what he had to say about if we could just all agree that we need to have some kind of a common government, that we could consent to that government and to do these things. And yet, I don't see any of that. I see we have the same problems that Cain and Abel had now. And there was a time when I remember reading things about humanity evolving and that we'd get to this point where we would, not technology-wise, although that might help, but that we'd start to realize that we're such a small planet. And all the things that we could accomplish if we just quit all this, the war, the fighting, and also just greed of one country to another, or even within our own country. So I was wondering, in all your studying, do you see something like that as far as humanity actually evolving? And if so, when is it going to happen?
There are basically two traditions of political philosophy, one which sees human nature as stable, and one which sees human nature as changeable. And the one that's stable says that, look, people are always going to be in conflict. People are always going to be self-interested at times. There's always going to be some sort of violence and aggression. And what we have to do is we have to figure out how to manage that and minimize the pain in order to offer as much assistance. And someone like John Locke and Adam Smith, the father of capitalism, John Stuart Mill, who introduces the idea of, say, a free market of ideas, they're on that tradition. But then there's the tradition that comes from Plato, that goes through Karl Marx, which says that human nature can change, and that at some point there's going to be some evolutionary or even revolutionary moment where something is going to happen, where human beings are going to suddenly realize that we can fix things. And so the skepticism that you express is representative of that first tradition, that, they keep saying we're going to get better and we aren't getting better. In response, I want to say, I think it's really easy to see the violence and the hostility, and we are at a particularly dark period right now where things seem, what fuels as much pessimism as we can muster. And I understand that. But at the same time, 95% of what we do daily involves living harmoniously with other people, whether it's watching people outside my house walk their dogs, greet each other, clean up after their dogs, and then go about their business, stopping at red lights, going at green lights, driving sober. Yes, people break those rules, and yes, people break those norms, but they're the vast minority. One of the wonderful things about North Dakota, and I have my criticisms as everyone else does, but one of my wonderful things about North Dakota is that we do tend to live in a low crime, low hostility, low tension environment. We live in a state where people have learned to live together in some really wonderful ways, some not so wonderful ways, but some wonderful ways. So you yourself have to decide whether or not you believe that human nature can change. And if you believe that human nature can change, then you can pull on the thread of again, people like Plato, people like Karl Marx, who want to give the conditions under which human nature can switch and become all good. But if you look at the history of humanity and say people are what they're going to be, that we're not going to evolve in some ways, then the trick is to figure out how we can live together in ways that recognize the limitations of who we are as good people, that we are all trying our best. Some people succeed better than others, and that the best way to do it, especially at a time right now, is to focus on the way that we take for granted the cup of sugar that we borrow, or the people who want to wish you happy birthday on Facebook, to take a mundane example. And I'll just give you one other thing, and then I'll open to other questions. My wife was born in 1968, and whenever she and I get despondent about the world and think about what it's going to be like for our 19-year-old daughter in 10 years, she reminds us both that 1968 was a time of tremendous upheaval in the United States and the world. Dr. King was killed. Robert Kennedy was killed. There were race riots all over the country. I can't remember the exact date of the Bay of Pigs and of the Cuban Missile Crisis, but it was on the tail end of that. America looked like it was falling completely apart, and then it didn't. And then we figured some things out, and we got better, and then we got a little worse, and we got better, and we got a little worse. Remember that the idea of being progressive means that there is slow, incremental, progressive change. And so whenever I become really despondent, I think about my wife's advice and remember that in 1968, it looked the same way as it does right now, and yet we survived and we did some good things in the process.
I was thinking about religion and how we consent to a higher power to control our lives, and how it relates to the political atmosphere of the current atmosphere. The reasons for religion, just control, motivating people, give us ethics and morals, but I see that failing in the current situation when it comes to, who we want to govern. Right now, half of the country thinks one way and half thinks the other way, and I look at that half that thinks way I don't think as being amoral. No ethics whatsoever, and there's what happened to religion and the control of religion should have, or motivating people.
I actually think that the answer to your question can be found in the mission of the Unitarian Universalist Church. The idea, as I understand it, and you all know much more about it than I do, but the idea behind it is that all religions have a core set of beliefs that overlap, that all religions share a certain kind of spirituality that speaks to the human condition and the human place in the universe, and that whether we interpret that as the divine or whether we interpret that as some other thing, it still is present in all of the great traditions. And that when we focus on what we all share, we are kinder, we are more caring, we are more gentle, we are more inclusive. And I think that at this time of increase in religious extremism, and in this time of increased, I'll use the term fanaticism at times, that the question that we have to ask is, do we look at the world as to how people are different, or do we look at the world as to how people are the same? This is actually the subject of the course that I'm teaching this semester. It's called Social and Political Philosophy. And the basic question of the class is, in a society in which people are different, in a pluralistic society, do you focus on how people are the same, or do you focus on how people are different? And right now, in this time of great tension, I think that we can learn from the Unitarian Universalist mission, that underneath it all, there is sameness. And if we can just find that sameness, we can figure out how to be kind to one another. And once we figure out how to be kind to one another, we can figure out how to talk with one another. I think a lot of people make the mistake and say, you have to figure out how to talk to one another first before you find the kindness, that the tensions, the hostilities has to be overcome before we can all be in a community together. But I actually think that's backwards. I think that we express ourselves with kindness first, with empathy, with understanding, and with that comes trust, and with social trust comes ease of conversation. And right now, the problem isn't that we are divided. The problem isn't that is that we're not trusting one another. And if we can trust one another, a lot of the other things will ease up. And I think that the way to trust another is just to be kind to our neighbors, to, again, be our brother's keeper. And I think that no one does that more in a way that is more illustrative than the Universalist mission, which is to say, what is it that all of these great traditions have in common? And how can we speak to it in a way that is authentic to all of the members who come week by week, day by day, year by year, and raise our children to find the commonality of humanity and the commonality of the spiritual experience, rather than the diversity and the divisive that comes from demanding a unique path and demanding an exclusive path. Not just that we are all different, because we all are, but that we are all different and our difference is superior. It's that superiority. It's that sense of hierarchy, that sense of me being better than you, that blocks off our ability to be kindness. So find what we share in common and be kind. And I think that you will find the return to be not just kindness, but understanding and a moderation of the more hostile, fanatical religious elements. And yes, there will always be outliers, but as long as they're outliers, they're manageable. When they become mainstream, it becomes much harder to deal with.
I will extinguish the chalice with these words from Ma Teresa Tet Castillo Gallardo, blessed with questions. Some came here to be blessed with answers in a tumultuous world. Let us hope too, however, that many of us have been blessed with questions to direct us with a clarity of mind, to steer our logic towards kindness and justice always.